A steaming cup of coffee. A quiet moment before the storm. The courtroom was alive with murmurs, lawyers preparing their notes, clerks shuffling paperwork, officers standing by in their rigid postures of authority. And then, one move, one action that would shatter the thin veil of civility in the room. The officer's hand jerked forward, and the scalding liquid exploded from the cup, cascading onto her face in an instant. The shock, the sharp sting of heat biting into her skin, the sheer audacity of it all happened too fast. A gasp rippled through the room, but no one spoke. No one moved. Time seemed frozen as the heavy aroma of burnt coffee filled the air. She stood there, motionless, her breath steady despite the pain searing across her cheek. The officer, standing tall in his pressed uniform, let out a dry, humorless chuckle. His lips curled into a smirk, his gaze dripping with the arrogance of someone who had gotten away with worse. He didn't see her as anything more than an inconvenience, another black woman who had the audacity to exist in his world. "You people never know your place," he muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with contempt. "Maybe next time, you'll think twice before stepping where you don't belong." Another beat of silence. The weight of his words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. She could feel the heat of 100 eyes on her, watching, waiting, expecting her to cower, to shrink back, to let this moment pass like so many others had before. But she didn't. She lifted her hand, slowly, deliberately, wiping the dark liquid from her cheek, her fingers trembling only slightly. The pain was secondary. The humiliation, the raw sting of being reduced to nothing in the eyes of this man, in the eyes of so many, it was a wound far deeper. She met his gaze. Not with fear. Not with anger. But with something far more dangerous, resolve. "Bailiff," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "Arrest this man." The words sliced through the silence like a blade. The officer's smirk faltered. His brows pulled together in confusion, then disbelief. A laugh, short and bitter, escaped his throat. "You must be out of your damn mind," he scoffed. "Do you know who I am?" She stepped forward. The room, once held in suspension, seemed to breathe again, murmurs rising, whispers spreading. The bailiff hesitated only for a fraction of a second before taking a step toward the officer. "I said," her voice cut through the noise, "arrest this man." The officer's confidence wavered. His eyes darted around the room, seeking validation, support, his fellow officers, the attorneys, someone who would step in, who would tell him this was a joke, a misunderstanding. But the expressions staring back at him were not what he expected. Some were stunned, others grim. No one spoke. No one moved to defend him. Realization dawned in pieces. His posture stiffened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "You can't do this," he barked, taking a step back. "You have no authority over me." But the moment the words left his mouth, the truth hit him like a wrecking ball. His breath caught. His pulse pounded in his ears. The woman standing before him, the one he had just doused with coffee, the one he had just tried to humiliate in front of an entire courtroom, she wasn't just anyone. She was the judge. The blood drained from his face, the weight of his mistake settling into his bones. He had seen her name on the file, but he hadn't made the connection. He hadn't expected her to be her. He had assumed, because of her skin, because of her presence outside the courtroom, because of his own blinding prejudice, that she was nothing. A clerk. A secretary. Someone beneath him. And now, he was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. "Bailiff," she said again, this time softer, but no less commanding. "Remove him from my courtroom." The officer's protests turned desperate. His voice rose, accusations flying, threats spilling from his lips like a drowning man grasping for air. "This is ridiculous. I was just," he turned, searching for his fellow officers. "You're really going to let this happen? After everything? We're supposed to be on the same side." But no one moved. Because there were cameras. Because there were witnesses. Because, for the first time in his life, his badge wouldn't protect him. The bailiff reached for his wrist. The officer jerked away. "Don't you dare touch me. Resisting will only make it worse," the judge warned, her voice like steel. A flicker of something unfamiliar crossed his face, fear. For so long, he had been the one holding the power, the one making the rules, bending them as he pleased, hiding behind the institution that had protected him for years. He had laughed in the face of accountability, because consequences were for other people. But now, in this moment, stripped of his authority, he felt it. The shift. The cold grip of reality settling in. His arms were wrenched behind his back. The cuffs locked around his wrists with a finality that sent a shudder down his spine. The room watched as the once mighty officer was escorted out, his protests turning into unintelligible grunts of rage and disbelief. And as he was dragged past her, the woman he had tried to break, the woman he had reduced to nothing in his mind, she didn't look away. She simply watched. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. But with the quiet certainty of someone who had always known that justice, in the end, would find its way. But this was only the beginning. Because what happened next? It was something no one expected. Before we dive into today's story, let's take a moment to make something crystal clear. Plow of Twist stands firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in any form. If you're watching this as a black viewer, know that your voice, your presence, and your existence matter. You deserve respect, dignity, and equality, not just in words, but in action. This story is a powerful reminder that justice always finds its way. So, sit back, enjoy, and let this tale unfold. And hey, if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because at Plow of Twist, we tell stories that matter. Now, let's get into it. Enjoy the story. The morning light filtered through the grand windows of the courthouse, casting long shadows over the polished wooden floors. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and crisp paper filled the air, mingling with the distant hum of conversations, hurried footsteps, and the occasional clatter of a gavel echoing through the hallways. This was the pulse of the justice system, cold, precise, unyielding. Inside those walls, lives were decided, futures were shaped, and, too often, the powerful walked free while the marginalized bore the weight of a system never designed for them. Judge Naomi Carter had spent years maneuvering through that system, learning its rules, mastering its intricacies, and proving, time and time again, that she belonged. It hadn't been easy. Nothing ever was when you were a black woman in a world that viewed your intelligence as a surprise and your authority as a mistake. But she had learned to navigate those landmines with grace, with poise, with an unwavering certainty in who she was. Her journey had begun long before she ever donned the black robes of justice. Raised in the heart of Atlanta by parents who worked tirelessly to give her the education they had been denied, Naomi had understood struggle before she could even spell the word. Her mother, Denise Carter, was a schoolteacher, molding young minds in an underfunded district where books were scarce but resilience was plenty. Her father, Raymond Carter, had been a construction worker, his hands rough with years of labor, his body aching from days spent under the scorching sun. They had instilled in her an unshakable drive, the knowledge that she would have to be twice as good, work twice as hard, just to be seen as half as competent. And so she did. Naomi excelled in school, earning scholarships, making a name for herself as a young woman with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. She attended Howard University, where she found her voice, where she learned not just the law but the weight of it, the way it had been wielded against people like her for generations. From there, she climbed the ranks, from public defender to prosecutor, fighting her way through rooms where she was the only black woman, the only woman at all, where every victory was met with quiet resentment and every mistake was amplified. But she never faltered. She had built herself from the ground up, brick by brick, until she stood at the pinnacle of her career, a sitting judge in one of the most prestigious courts in the state. And yet, even here, even with her gavel in hand and the authority of the law behind her, she knew there were those who still saw her as less. She felt it in the glances, in the microaggressions, in the way certain attorneys would talk over her, the way certain officers would hesitate before following her orders, as if waiting for someone else to confirm that, yes, the black woman at the bench was the one in charge. One of those men was Officer Brian Calloway. He had been in law enforcement for nearly 2 decades, a veteran of the force, the kind of cop who prided himself on old-school policing. He wore his badge like armor, carried his authority like a weapon, and walked through the world with the unshakable confidence of a man who had never had to answer for his actions. He had been raised in a small town in Mississippi, the son of a sheriff, the grandson of a sheriff, his family's legacy etched into the very foundation of his beliefs. To him, the law wasn't about justice, it was about control. And people like Naomi Carter, people who challenged that control, who sat in positions of power he believed they had no right to, were a threat. Brian had encountered her before, in passing, but had never paid much attention. To him, she was just another bureaucrat, another obstacle, another face in a system he believed had gone soft. But today was different. He was set to testify in a case involving the use of excessive force against a black teenager. The boy, just 17, had been thrown to the ground, his head slammed against the pavement, his body bruised and bloodied. The officer responsible had insisted that the force was necessary, that the kid had resisted, that protocol had been followed. Brian had been brought in as a character witness, to vouch for the officer, to paint the teenager as a delinquent, to remind the courtroom that the police were the ones under attack, not the other way around. But then, he saw her. Naomi stood at the front of the courtroom, her presence commanding, her expression unreadable as she reviewed the case file before her. The moment he laid eyes on her, something in him bristled. He didn't recognize her at first, not as a judge. She wasn't in her robes yet, just dressed in a sleek navy suit, her curls pulled back into a tight bun. She looked too young, too confident, too out of place. So, when he saw her near the coffee station, pouring herself a cup, he couldn't help himself. Didn't know they let secretaries drink the judge's coffee, he muttered, loud enough for her to hear, watching for her reaction. Naomi glanced at him, her face unreadable. She had heard worse. She had learned to let comments like that roll off her skin like rain on glass. But then he stepped closer, his presence looming. Must be nice, he continued, walking around here like you run the place. She raised an eyebrow, her grip tightening on the cup. Excuse me. Brian let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Relax, sweetheart. Just saying, people should know their place. And then, before she could respond, before she could shut him down the way she had shut down so many men like him before, he did something he would regret for the rest of his life. He reached out, took her cup, and with one swift motion, he tossed it in her face. The burn was immediate, searing across her cheek, dripping down her neck. The room gasped. Conversations halted. The scent of scorched skin filled the air. Brian smirked, pleased with himself, expecting her to recoil, to crumble, to shrink under the humiliation. But Naomi Carter was not a woman who shrank. Slowly, deliberately, she wiped the coffee from her face. And then, she looked at him. Not with anger. Not with rage. With certainty. Bailiff, she said, her voice like steel. Arrest this man. And in that moment, Brian Calloway's world began to unravel. Because the woman he had just tried to break wasn't a secretary. She was the judge. And his life was about to change forever. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut around Brian Calloway's wrists reverberated through the courthouse corridor like a gunshot. A stunned silence fell over the room, the kind that only occurs when something unthinkable has just happened. No one had ever seen a uniformed officer dragged out of a courtroom in shackles, not here, not in this way, not by order of a black woman. It was as if the very laws of the universe had been rewritten in that instant, as if the natural order had been disrupted. Naomi Carter stood firm, her expression unreadable, her posture unshaken. But inside, a storm brewed, because she knew what was coming. A man like Brian Calloway wouldn't go down without a fight. He struggled against the bailiff's grip, his face twisted in a mix of disbelief and rage. "You can't do this. This is bullshit. You're making a mistake, lady. You hear me? A goddamn mistake." His voice was sharp, desperate, tinged with the realization that, for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in control. His fellow officers looked on, their faces stiff with shock, their hands hovering near their belts as if some instinct told them to intervene. But none of them moved. None of them dared. Because they knew, this wasn't a moment they could erase, wasn't a story they could twist in his favor. Naomi watched as he was pulled toward the exit, his shouts bouncing off the marble walls, each one a crack in the foundation of the world he had built for himself. She had seen men like him her entire life. Men who wielded power like a sledgehammer, who treated respect like a privilege that only belonged to them. They always believed they were untouchable, until the day they weren't. She turned back to her bench, adjusting her robe as the murmurs in the room grew louder. The attorneys whispered among themselves, unsure of what had just transpired. The clerks exchanged nervous glances. The defendant, the young black teenager Brian had come here to testify against, stared wide-eyed, his hands clenched into fists beneath the table. For the first time since entering this building, he looked like he had hope. Naomi took a breath, her voice cutting through the commotion. "This court is now in recess. We will resume in 20 minutes. And with that, she stepped down from the bench, exiting through the private door that led to her chambers. Inside, she leaned against the desk, exhaling slowly. Her skin still burned from the coffee, the redness vivid against her complexion. But it wasn't the physical pain that rattled her, it was the weight of what had just happened. She had expected backlash, had anticipated resistance. What she hadn't expected was the sheer satisfaction in Brian's face as he threw that coffee. He had enjoyed it. He had thought he could humiliate her, strip her of her dignity in a single act. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. It was Officer Hughes, one of the few policemen in the building she actually trusted. He stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He shook his head, exhaling. "I don't even have words, Judge Carter. I've known Calloway for years, but I never thought he stopped himself, as if realizing how foolish the statement was. Naomi studied him for a moment. "You never thought he'd do something so blatantly reckless. But you knew what kind of man he was." Hughes didn't answer immediately. He rubbed a hand over his face, his jaw tightening. "I knew he had opinions. I knew he pushed boundaries. But this was something else." He sighed. "He's already demanding to speak to the chief. He's saying you overstepped. That you made it personal." A dry laugh escaped her lips. "I made it personal." She gestured to the stains on her skin, to the damp fabric of her robe. "He attacked me. In a courthouse. In front of witnesses. And I'm the one who overstepped." Hughes grimaced. "I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's what he's going to use to turn this around. He's calling his union rep, he's calling his lawyer. You know how this works, Judge Carter. He's not going down without a fight." She already knew that. Men like Brian Calloway didn't accept consequences. They twisted the narrative, shifted blame, used every tool at their disposal to escape accountability. This was only the beginning. The next few days were a whirlwind. The footage from the courthouse security cameras leaked to the press, and within hours, the incident was all over the news. Headlines flashed across the screen: "Veteran officer arrested after assaulting judge in shocking courtroom incident." The footage replayed on every major network, commentators dissecting every frame. Some called it an unprecedented moment of justice. Others called it an overreaction. And then, of course, there were the voices who insisted that Naomi had provoked him, that she had embarrassed him, that she had escalated the situation. Brian Calloway, from his holding cell, played the victim perfectly. He released a statement through his lawyer, claiming that he had acted in a moment of frustration, but had never intended harm. He described himself as a loyal officer, who had dedicated his life to protecting the community and was now being vilified for a misunderstanding. And people believed him. The police union issued a statement condemning his arrest, calling it a gross misuse of judicial power. The Fraternal Order of Police organized a rally, officers marching in solidarity, demanding his reinstatement. Social media exploded, the battle lines drawn between those who saw Naomi as a hero and those who saw her as the problem. Threats began pouring in. Calls to her office, emails filled with hate, anonymous letters slipped under her door. She was accused of playing the race card, of ruining a good man's career. But she didn't flinch. She had seen this before. This was the playbook. Then, something happened that no one expected. A whistleblower. An anonymous tip to the press. Leaked files. A history of complaints against Brian Calloway, buried deep within the system, hidden from public view. Allegations of excessive force. Racial profiling. Witness intimidation. And then, the worst of it, sealed records revealing that he had been under investigation for corruption, for planting evidence, for covering up misconduct within his department. The story shifted overnight. Suddenly, Brian Calloway wasn't just a disgraced officer. He was a liability. His supporters grew quieter. The department distanced itself. And Naomi? She knew exactly what was about to happen. Because once the system decided you were no longer worth protecting, it didn't just let you fall. It threw you to the wolves. And Brian Calloway was about to learn exactly what that felt like. The courtroom was packed. Every seat filled, every corner occupied. Journalists lined the back of the room, their pens poised, their cameras ready. The tension in the air was thick, electric, the kind that made people hold their breath without realizing it. This wasn't just another trial. This was a reckoning. Naomi Carter sat at the bench, her expression unreadable, her presence commanding. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, knowing that the world was watching, waiting to see if justice would truly be served. Across the room, Brian Calloway sat at the defendant's table, his suit crisp, his posture stiff, his face a mask of forced confidence. But she could see it, the way his fingers twitched against his knee, the way his eyes darted toward the jury every few seconds, the way he clenched his jaw as if grinding his teeth was the only thing keeping him from breaking apart. His lawyer, a man who had made a career out of defending corrupt officers, stood as if he owned the room. "Your Honor, my client is a decorated officer, a man who has dedicated his life to protecting this city. What happened was an unfortunate misunderstanding, a moment of frustration blown wildly out of proportion by the media." He turned to the jury, his voice lowering as if revealing a secret. Think about it. A man who has spent 20 years on the force, who has put his life on the line day after day, suddenly has his entire career destroyed over a single cup of coffee. Naomi didn't react. She had expected this argument, had known they would try to minimize, to twist, to reframe the facts into something palatable for those desperate to believe that men like Brian Calloway couldn't possibly be what they seemed. The prosecutor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ava Reynolds, wasted no time. A single cup of coffee? She let out a short, humorless laugh. "We're not here because of coffee. We're here because Officer Calloway thought he could assault a sitting judge and walk away without consequences. We're here because this is part of a pattern, a long, documented history of abuse, misconduct, and corruption that was buried for years until now." She turned to the jury, her voice steady, unwavering. "You've seen the evidence. The reports that were hidden. The victims who were silenced. This isn't about one incident. This is about a man who believed himself untouchable. Calloway shifted in his seat, his lips pressing into a thin line. His lawyer attempted to object, but Naomi lifted a hand, silencing him with a look. "Overruled," she said, her voice calm, controlled. "Proceed." Ava nodded, stepping forward. "Let's talk about the evidence." She gestured toward the screen beside her, and within seconds, the courtroom was filled with the grainy footage of Calloway shoving a teenager against a car, his hand gripping the boy's neck. Another clip played, Calloway pressing his knee into the back of a handcuffed man. Another, Calloway laughing as he kicked over a black woman's purse during a traffic stop, her belongings scattering across the pavement. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder with each clip, the weight of the truth pressing down like a lead blanket. Calloway's lawyer stood, his voice rising in desperation. "These incidents were investigated and dismissed, they were covered up," Ava corrected sharply, cutting him off. "By men just like your client, men who protected each other instead of the people they swore to serve." Naomi watched Calloway closely, saw the way his composure cracked, the way his fingers dug into the table as if he could physically hold himself together. He had expected to walk into this courtroom and leave with a slap on the wrist. He had expected his badge, his connections, his privilege to shield him. But none of those things were saving him now. Then came the final blow. "We have a witness," Ava announced, her voice calm but laced with something undeniable, finality. Calloway stiffened. His lawyer turned sharply. "We were not informed of any additional witnesses." Ava barely spared him a glance. "Because we didn't want to give your client time to intimidate them, the way he has done in the past." The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and for the first time in the entire trial, Calloway's face drained of color. Because the man walking toward the stand wasn't just anyone. It was one of his own. Detective Marcus Hale, a veteran officer, a man Calloway had worked beside for years. The murmurs in the room grew louder. A police officer testifying against another officer. That was rare. That was dangerous. Hale took his seat at the witness stand, adjusting his tie, his expression unreadable. Ava wasted no time. "Detective Hale, can you confirm for the court whether Officer Calloway engaged in misconduct during his time on the force?" Hale's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering toward Calloway, who stared at him with something between betrayal and rage. "Yes," he said finally, his voice steady. A ripple of shock ran through the courtroom. Ava didn't hesitate. "Did you ever witness Officer Calloway abuse his power?" "Yes." "Did you ever see him falsify reports? Plant evidence?" "Yes." Calloway's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection. This is hearsay." Ava turned, holding up a file. "Not hearsay. Official records, obtained from an internal source, detailing years of misconduct that were deliberately erased from department records. Along with sworn testimony from multiple officers willing to corroborate these claims." Naomi felt the energy in the room shift. This was the moment. The turning point. Calloway was no longer just a disgraced officer on trial. He was a liability. And he knew it. His lawyer turned to him, whispering urgently, but Calloway didn't respond. His gaze was fixed ahead, his hands gripping the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Naomi could see it in his eyes, that moment of realization, that split second where he understood that everything he had built was crumbling beneath him. That there was no escape, no lifeline, no shield left to protect him. She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady, deliberate. "Officer Calloway, would you like to take the stand in your own defense?" The silence that followed was deafening. Calloway didn't move. Didn't speak. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. And Naomi Carter. She had never felt more certain of justice. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. Because what happened next, what happened after the verdict, was something no one saw coming. The weight of the courtroom was suffocating, pressing down on every person inside, thick with the kind of tension that made even the most composed individuals shift in their seats, adjusting ties, folding hands, swallowing hard against the silence. It was the kind of atmosphere that turned whispers into echoes, that made every movement feel too loud, too significant, as if each second stretched into eternity. The room itself felt smaller somehow, the walls inching closer, trapping those inside in a moment that no one would soon forget. Naomi Carter sat at the bench, unshaken, composed, her spine straight, her fingers barely brushing against the polished wood as she watched the man before her unravel. Officer Brian Calloway sat at the defendant's table, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth should have cracked under the pressure. His suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly aligned, but beneath the veneer of professionalism, there was something festering, something raw. His hands twitched, fingers tapping against his knee in an erratic rhythm, his leg bouncing ever so slightly, a nervous tick betraying the storm within. His eyes, once filled with arrogant confidence, now darted across the room, searching for an escape, for some semblance of control, for an ally who would never come. His lawyer, an older man with salt and pepper hair and the exhausted demeanor of someone who had spent too many years defending the indefensible, stood beside him, whispering urgently in his ear, his voice low and sharp, a last-ditch effort to hold together the unraveling threads of a case that had slipped beyond his grasp. But Calloway wasn't listening. He didn't hear the words being spoken to him, didn't register the strategy being fed to him. His mind was elsewhere, spiraling, grasping for something solid, something to cling to as the ground crumbled beneath his feet. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent years believing himself untouchable, moving through the world with the unwavering certainty that consequences were for other people, that rules bent for men like him, that power was a currency he had in endless supply. And yet, here he was, shackled by a system he had long believed would always protect him. Naomi's voice cut through the silence like a scalpel, precise and unyielding. "Officer Calloway, I will ask again. Do you wish to take the stand in your defense?" The weight of her words settled over the room like a stone thrown into still water, rippling outward, shifting the energy, demanding attention. Calloway's lips parted slightly, the beginnings of a response forming, but nothing came out. For the first time in his life, words failed him. The man who had spent years issuing commands, making arrests, delivering verdicts before trials even began, found himself without a single defense. His voice, once a weapon he wielded so carelessly, had abandoned him. His lawyer, sensing the finality of the moment, pressed a hand against his shoulder, a silent plea to let it go, to stop the bleeding before it became fatal. But the damage had already been done. Naomi held his gaze, steady and unwavering. "Very well," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 truths. She turned her attention to the jury, her eyes sweeping over them, taking in the expressions of the men and women who had spent days listening to testimonies, examining evidence, unraveling the tangled mess of corruption that had shielded Calloway for years. "You have heard the testimony. You have seen the evidence. You have witnessed firsthand the character of the defendant before you. The law is clear. The facts are clear. The only question that remains is whether or not justice will be served today." The words hung in the air, a challenge, a command, an undeniable truth. The jury foreman, a middle-aged black woman with deep lines carved into her face, the kind that spoke of experience, of knowledge, of battles fought and scars earned, stood with quiet authority. She held a small slip of paper in her hands, the weight of its contents pressing down on her, but her expression never wavered. She looked at Naomi, at Calloway, then at the courtroom that waited with bated breath. And then she spoke. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Brian Calloway, guilty on all charges." The words detonated like a bomb, the impact immediate and irreversible. A collective exhale rippled through the room, a mixture of relief, disbelief, and long-overdue vindication. Some gasped, others nodded solemnly, acknowledging the gravity of what had just occurred. But Naomi remained composed, her grip firm, her presence unshaken. This was not a moment of triumph. It was not victory. It was merely justice, late, imperfect, but justice nonetheless. She turned her attention back to Calloway, watching him absorb the words, watching as the final pieces of his carefully crafted reality collapsed around him. His face contorted, a mixture of fury and shock warring for dominance. His body tensed, his fingers curling into fists so tight that his knuckles turned white. He opened his mouth, but for a moment, nothing came out, as if even his rage was struggling to find a voice. Ava Reynolds, the prosecutor, let out a slow breath, a quiet nod of acknowledgement. The battle fought, the war won. Naomi's voice was steady as she spoke. Sentencing will be scheduled for a later date. Officer Calloway is to be taken into custody immediately. And that was the moment he broke. This is bullshit. The words erupted from him, raw and venomous, filling the courtroom with the sound of a man unraveling. He shot to his feet, his lawyer scrambling to pull him back down, but there was no containing him now. His face, flushed red with rage, twisted into something almost unrecognizable, his carefully controlled facade shattered beyond repair. You set me up. This whole thing was rigged. You think this makes you powerful? You think you won? His gaze landed on Naomi, his voice dripping with venom, with the last remnants of the control he so desperately clung to. You're just another black bitch on a power trip. The courtroom erupted. Gasps filled the air, shockwaves rolling through the space. Naomi didn't move. Didn't blink. She had seen this before, had heard worse, had spent her entire life preparing for moments like this. A lifetime of resilience, of armor built over years of fighting to be heard, to be respected, to exist in spaces that were never meant for her. Calloway thrashed as the bailiffs moved in, their hands closing around his arms, dragging him back, his struggles turning into something desperate, feral. Get your hands off me. You're all traitors. Every single one of you. His voice cracked at the edges, the hysteria creeping in. I built this city. I kept you safe. And this is how you repay me. Naomi leaned forward ever so slightly, her voice quiet, deadly in its precision. You didn't keep this city safe. You kept it afraid. Calloway's struggles faltered for a moment, the words cutting deeper than any gavel, any verdict, any cell ever could. The reality of it, the undeniable truth in her words, struck something inside him. And in that moment, he knew. It was over. The courtroom doors swung open as the bailiffs dragged him out, his shouts echoing down the hallway, the sound of a man fighting against the inevitable. The weight of justice, long overdue, settled over the room. For everyone else, this was history. A moment to be remembered, to be analyzed, to be dissected in the years to come. But for Naomi, it was never about making history. It was about making things right. And as she stood from her bench, gathering her things, she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The aftermath of the verdict was unlike anything the city had seen before. The air outside the courthouse was thick with tension, the streets packed with protesters, journalists, police officers, and onlookers who had come to witness history unfold. The media had turned the case into a national spectacle, their cameras flashing, their microphones shoved forward as reporters jostled for position, eager to capture the first words from those involved. The verdict of guilty on all charges had sent shockwaves through the city, igniting conversations, debates, and a firestorm of emotions on both sides. Naomi Carter stepped out of the courthouse, her face unreadable as she moved through the crowd, flanked by security. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, the understanding that this was bigger than just one case, bigger than just one corrupt officer finally facing consequences. This was a moment of reckoning, the kind that came rarely, the kind that history would remember. She could hear the chants from both sides of the crowd, some voices calling her a hero, others branding her a traitor, a disgrace, an enemy of law enforcement. It was all noise, background static to the real work that still had to be done. She didn't stop for interviews, didn't acknowledge the reporters who shouted her name, demanding a statement. She wasn't here for spectacle. The courtroom had spoken. The law had spoken. And yet, the battle wasn't over. She knew that. It never was. Justice wasn't a singular event. It was a process, an ongoing fight, and for every step forward, there were always those ready to push things back. Inside the courthouse, Brian Calloway had been led through the back in trance, his wrists cuffed, his face a twisted mask of anger, disbelief, and something bordering on terror. His world had crumbled in a matter of weeks, and now, with the cameras capturing every move, every expression, he had nowhere to hide. He had spent years being the man with the authority, the man who dictated how others would be punished, how others would suffer, how others would be controlled. But now, for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one giving orders. He was the one being ordered. The shift in power was something he had never prepared for, something he had never thought possible. He was shoved into the back of the transport vehicle, the sound of the doors slamming shut like the final toll of a bell. The ride to the holding facility was silent except for the occasional crackle of the radio, the voices of officers going about their business as if he were just another criminal, another statistic in the system. He wanted to scream at them, to tell them this was wrong, that this wasn't supposed to happen, that he was one of them. But he knew it wouldn't matter. His fellow officers had turned their backs. The city had turned its back. The system that had once shielded him had decided he was no longer worth protecting. Inside the holding facility, the intake process was nothing short of humiliating. His belongings were confiscated, his fingerprints taken, his mugshot snapped under the harsh fluorescent lighting. The officers processing him didn't speak much, didn't look at him the way they once had. He could see it in their faces, the recognition that he had become a liability, a stain on the force, someone they had to distance themselves from. He was no longer one of them. He was an example. A cautionary tale. As he was led to his temporary cell, the reality of it all crashed down on him in waves. The cold, unyielding walls. The steel bars. The knowledge that he would spend the rest of his life fighting to reclaim what he had lost. He had always believed himself invincible, untouchable, but now, he was just another man in a jumpsuit, waiting to be processed, waiting to be sentenced, waiting for a future he no longer controlled. Back at the courthouse, Naomi sat in her chambers, her hands resting on the surface of her desk, her mind still processing the events of the day. She knew this case would set a precedent. She knew that for every person celebrating this moment as a victory, there were others plotting their next move, waiting for an opportunity to retaliate. Power never shifted easily. Change never came without resistance. And while she had ensured that Brian Calloway would face the consequences of his actions, she also knew that the system itself was far from cleansed. There would always be another Calloway. Another man who thought himself above the law. Another battle waiting just around the corner. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Ava Reynolds stepped in, her expression a mix of exhaustion and something else, satisfaction, perhaps, but tempered with the knowledge that this was just one case in a sea of many. "You did it," Ava said, closing the door behind her. Naomi let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "We did it. And even then, it's not over." Ava sat across from her, nodding. "It never is." She paused, studying Naomi for a moment before adding, "But today. Today, we won." Naomi allowed herself a small smile, the kind that barely reached her eyes. For now. The conversation was interrupted by her phone buzzing on the desk. A message flashed across the screen, another request for an interview, another demand for her to speak publicly on what had happened. She ignored it. She had no interest in turning this into a media tour. Justice wasn't a performance. Outside, the city was still buzzing. Some were celebrating. Some were furious. Some were simply trying to understand what this verdict meant for the future. But one thing was certain, things had changed. A man who had once operated with impunity had been held accountable. And while it wouldn't erase the harm he had caused, it sent a message. A message that even those who believed themselves untouchable could fall. As the night stretched on, the noise of the city outside her window eventually quieted, but Naomi knew the battle was far from over. There would be appeals, there would be backlash, there would be more fights ahead. But for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to breathe. Because no matter what came next, no matter how hard the road ahead would be, one thing was undeniable. The system that had protected Brian Calloway for so long had finally turned against him. And there was no coming back from that. The holding cell was cold, sterile, and indifferent to the man now sitting inside it. Brian Calloway sat on the hard metal bench, his hands resting between his knees, fingers curled into fists so tight his knuckles had turned white. His breathing was shallow, uneven, his chest rising and falling as he stared at the gray cinderblock wall in front of him. The silence was suffocating. The hum of fluorescent lights above him buzzed incessantly, adding to the pounding in his skull. The sounds of the facility, the distant voices of officers processing other inmates, the mechanical clang of doors locking, the occasional murmur of someone shifting in another cell, faded into background noise, nothing more than a distant reminder of how far he had fallen. His mind replayed the trial over and over again like a broken record. The moment the jury had delivered the verdict, the way Naomi Carter had looked at him, not with gloating, not with satisfaction, but with something worse. Certainty. As if she had always known this was how it would end for him. He clenched his jaw, grinding his teeth together so hard it hurt. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent his entire life on the other side of this process. He had been the one in control, the one deciding who walked free and who didn't. He had been the one with the power. And now, here he was, reduced to nothing more than an inmate waiting to be processed into a system that had once served him so well. A guard approached the bars, his expression blank. "You've got a visitor," he said, his voice flat, uninterested, as if Brian was just another name on a long list of men who thought they were above consequences. Brian's eyes flicked up, his body tensing. "Who?" His voice came out rough, unused for the past several hours. The guard didn't answer. Instead, he simply unlocked the door, gesturing for Brian to stand. He hesitated, but what choice did he have? He pushed himself up, his muscles aching from sitting in the same position for too long. His body felt stiff, foreign, like it didn't belong to him anymore. He followed the guard down the dimly lit corridor, his boots scuffing against the floor. Every step echoed, the sound bouncing off the walls, reminding him that he wasn't walking with authority anymore, he was being led. Like every man he had arrested, like every criminal he had tossed into a holding cell without a second thought, he was now just another case file, another number in the system. They stopped in front of a small visitation room. The guard nodded toward the door. 5 minutes, he muttered, unlocking it and stepping aside. Brian took a deep breath before stepping inside, his eyes immediately landing on the woman sitting across the table. Naomi Carter. A slow, simmering anger bubbled up in his chest. Of course, it was her. She was the reason he was here. The reason his life had imploded. The reason he had lost everything. His jaw tightened, but he forced himself to sit down across from her, his hands gripping the edge of the metal table between them. Naomi met his gaze with calm, unwavering eyes. She wasn't here to gloat. That much was clear. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no smugness in the way she carried herself. Just that same certainty, the same quiet authority that had stripped him of everything he had once believed untouchable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was thick, suffocating, but Naomi remained composed, unaffected by the weight of his glare. Finally, she broke the silence. "You look tired," she said simply, her voice even, measured. Brian let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "What the hell do you want?" Naomi exhaled through her nose, tilting her head slightly. "I wanted to see you like this. Not for revenge. Not for satisfaction. I just wanted you to sit in this chair, to feel what it's like to have no control over what happens next. Brian clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. Congratulations. You got what you wanted. Is that it? You came here to make sure I know that you won. Naomi shook her head. This was never about winning, Calloway. That's your problem. You always thought this was a game, that power was something you could hoard, something that made you immune to consequences. You never thought this moment would come because, in your mind, men like you don't lose. Brian's nostrils flared, his body rigid. You don't know a damn thing about me. I know enough, she said, leaning forward slightly. I know you spent years terrorizing people who couldn't fight back. I know you used your badge like a shield, believing it would protect you from the damage you caused. I know you never thought twice about the people you hurt, because to you, they weren't real. They were obstacles. Problems. Names on a report. But now. She gestured around the room, her expression unreadable. Now, you're the problem. Now, you're the man on the other side of the bars. Brian's jaw tightened, his throat constricting as he fought back the surge of rage crawling up his spine. He had spent his life defining power in a singular way, who was in control and who wasn't. And now, for the first time, he was on the wrong side of that equation. Naomi studied him for a long moment before speaking again, her voice quieter, but no less firm. What do you see when you look in the mirror, Calloway? His lips parted, but no words came out. He didn't know how to answer that. He didn't know if he wanted to. You spent your whole life thinking you were different. That you were above the people you arrested, above the system you swore to serve. But in the end, you ended up just like them. The only difference is, they never had a choice. You did. And you still made the wrong one. Brian swallowed hard, his breath uneven. He wanted to fight back, to argue, to deny everything she was saying, but what could he say? What argument did he have left? He had already lost. Naomi sat back, exhaling slowly. This is what accountability looks like, Calloway. Not because I wanted it. Not because I orchestrated some grand conspiracy against you. But because the truth caught up with you. And the truth has no sympathy. The door opened behind them, the guard stepping inside. Time's up, he said flatly. Naomi rose to her feet, straightening her blazer. Brian stayed seated, his hands trembling slightly against the table, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. He had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable. And now, here he was, staring at the only person who had ever proved him wrong. As Naomi turned to leave, she paused at the door, looking back at him one final time. Good luck, Calloway, she said, her voice devoid of malice, but heavy with finality. You're going to need it. And then she was gone. Brian sat there, alone, staring at the empty space she had left behind. And for the first time in his life, he had nothing. No badge. No power. No way out. Just himself. And that was the scariest thing of all. The cold, gray walls of the prison cell felt smaller by the second, the dim light above flickering, casting uneven shadows that stretched across the hard floor. Brian Calloway sat on a thin mattress, his hands clasped together, elbows resting on his knees, his head bowed slightly as if he were trying to shut out everything around him. The air was thick, heavy, almost suffocating, carrying the distant echoes of voices from the other cells, the occasional clank of metal doors, the low murmur of guards making their rounds. Time felt distorted here, stretched and compressed all at once, hours bleeding into each other until they became meaningless. He had once believed that he understood the system inside and out, that he knew what it felt like to have control over the lives of men who sat in cells just like this. But now, for the first time, he was the one with no control, no authority, no power. Just another prisoner. Just another case number in a facility full of men who had stories just like his, stories he had never cared to hear. The door to his cell opened with a slow, mechanical creak, the sound sending a jolt through his body. He looked up, his muscles tensing automatically, a lifetime of instinct making him brace himself before he even knew who stood in the doorway. A guard stepped in first, a blank expression on his face, followed by a figure Brian hadn't expected to see again, Detective Marcus Hale. The sight of Hale standing in his cell doorway sent a rush of conflicting emotions through Brian's chest. Betrayal. Resentment. Anger. This was the man who had stood in court and testified against him, the man who had sat in that witness box and exposed every dirty secret, every crime Brian had thought was buried deep enough to never see the light of day. Hale had been a friend, a colleague, someone Brian had trusted to have his back no matter what. But when it mattered most, Hale had turned against him. And now, here he was, standing in front of him as if they were just two men having a conversation, as if the past few weeks hadn't shattered everything Brian had built. Hale stepped inside, hands tucked into his pockets, his expression unreadable. "How's it feel?" he asked, his voice even, carrying no malice, no triumph, just a quiet weight that settled into the room. Brian exhaled sharply, shaking his head as he let out a low, bitter chuckle. "How do you think it feels?" His voice was rough, raw, as if the words scraped against his throat on the way out. He looked up at Hale, his gaze hard, accusing. "You really came all the way down here to see it for yourself? To watch me rot in this cell? You get off on this, Hale." Hale didn't react to the hostility in Brian's tone. He simply studied him, his expression calm, steady. "I came here to see if you finally get it." Brian scoffed, shifting on the mattress, his shoulders tightening. "Get what? That I lost? That my life is over? That people like you don't give a damn about loyalty?" He spat the word out like it was poison. Hale took a step forward, his voice lower now, quieter, but still carrying the weight of something undeniable. "Loyalty? You think that's what this was about? You think I betrayed you?" He shook his head, exhaling slowly. "Loyalty to what, Brian? To covering for you? To watching you destroy lives and pretending like it didn't matter? That's not loyalty. That's complicity." Brian clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists against his knees. "You think you're better than me? You sat next to me for years, Hale. You knew what was happening, and you didn't say a damn thing. Until you did. Until it was convenient. Until you got to play the hero in front of that courtroom." Hale's eyes darkened, something shifting in his stance. "You're right," he admitted, his tone firm but edged with something that almost sounded like regret. "I didn't say anything for years. And that's on me. I let it happen. I watched you cross lines over and over again, and I let it slide because it was easier than standing up. I told myself that the system was bigger than both of us, that one cop couldn't change anything. I let you get away with it because I was too much of a coward to speak up. And yeah, I have to live with that. But you?" He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. "You don't get to sit here and act like you're the victim. Not after everything." Brian's nostrils flared, his breathing sharp, heavy. He wanted to fire back, to lash out, to tear Hale apart with his words, but the problem was, he had nothing. No defense. No justification. No excuse that would change the reality of what had happened. Hale had turned against him, but only because Brian had given him every reason to. Hale straightened, his expression hardening. "You were always so damn sure you were untouchable. That the badge meant you could do whatever the hell you wanted, that consequences were for other people. Well, here's your consequence, Brian. You sit in this cell, and you live with it. You live with everything you did, every person you hurt, every lie you told yourself to justify it all. Because no one's coming to save you. Not the department. Not the union. Not the men you used to call your brothers. Brian swallowed hard, his throat tight, his pulse hammering against his skin. For years, he had built his identity around his position, around the idea that the system would always protect him, that no matter what, he would always land on his feet. But the system had turned its back on him the second it decided he wasn't worth saving. The people he had once trusted had disappeared, and now, the only thing left was the truth. Hale turned to leave, pausing at the doorway, his voice quieter now. You once told me that power is about who's in control. That as long as you're the one calling the shots, you'll always be safe. He glanced back over his shoulder, his eyes cold. How's that working out for you now? And with that, he was gone, the door locking behind him with a final, metallic clang that echoed through the small cell. Brian stayed where he was, his hands still gripping his knees, his entire body rigid. He had spent his entire life believing that control was everything, that as long as he held the power, nothing else mattered. But now, sitting in this cell, stripped of everything, with no one left to fight for him, he realized the truth he had refused to see for years. He had never been in control. He had just been waiting for the fall. And now, there was no one left to catch him. The prison doors slammed shut behind Brian Calloway, sealing him into the reality he had spent his entire life believing would never touch him. The sound reverberated down the long corridor, each step he took toward his new existence feeling heavier than the last. The jumpsuit clung to his body, stiff and unfamiliar, a stark contrast to the crisp uniform he once wore with a sense of entitlement. The guards barely looked at him, their expressions unreadable, their movements mechanical. He was no longer one of them. He was no longer anyone. The weight of it settled on his chest like a boulder, pressing down with every breath he took. His name had been erased from the precinct's walls, his legacy wiped from the department's history. He was a disgrace. A name they would spit out when they wanted to prove that the system could correct itself, a warning to others who thought they could do what he did and get away with it. His cell was small, sterile, suffocating. The thin mattress barely cushioned the hard metal frame beneath it. The walls, once painted white but now graying with age and neglect, held the remnants of past prisoners, scratched words, tally marks, desperate messages carved into the stone as if begging someone to remember that they had existed. He ran his fingers over one of the carvings, his mind distant, his throat dry. He had spent years looking at men behind bars, passing judgment, deciding their fate with a simple stroke of a pen, never once thinking about what it felt like to be on the other side. But now he knew. Now he felt it in his bones, in the deafening silence of the prison at night, in the way his name no longer carried weight, no longer instilled fear or demanded respect. He had become what he spent his life despising. Just another inmate. Just another man behind bars. And the worst part? There was no one left to blame but himself. Naomi Carter sat in her office, the city skyline stretching beyond the tall windows, the lights of the world outside flickering like distant stars. The trial had ended, the verdict delivered, but the weight of it still lingered. The calls kept coming, the media still buzzing, the public still divided. Some called her a hero, a symbol of justice finally catching up to corruption. Others saw her as an enemy, a woman who had dismantled one of their own, an institution they believed to be untouchable. But Naomi had never been in this for admiration or approval. She had done what needed to be done. Nothing more. Nothing less. Ava Reynolds had stopped by earlier that day, a rare smile playing on her lips as she placed a case file on Naomi's desk. Another officer under investigation. Another name that had been protected for far too long. Naomi glanced at the file but didn't open it right away. She already knew what it contained. The cycle never stopped. The system didn't heal itself overnight. There would always be another fight. Another courtroom. Another verdict. But this time, people were watching. This time, the world had seen what accountability could look like. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start a change that couldn't be undone. Marcus Hale sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, his mind weighed down with memories of the trial, of the testimony, of the years he had spent looking the other way. He had done what was right in the end, but it didn't erase the guilt. It didn't undo the times he had stayed silent when he should have spoken up. It didn't bring back the people who had suffered under Calloway's reign. He had spent years believing that loyalty meant standing by his fellow officers, even when he knew they were wrong. But loyalty, he had come to realize, meant doing what was right, even when it cost you everything. He had lost friends, lost respect from the people who once called him a brother. But he had gained something he had never truly valued before, his own integrity. Back in his cell, Brian Calloway sat with his back against the cold wall, his hands resting limply on his knees, his eyes staring at the floor. He had been inside for weeks now, long enough to understand the rhythm of this place, long enough to know that he was no longer feared, no longer respected. He was just another man waiting for the days to blend into months, the months into years. He had tried to fight it at first, tried to hold on to the arrogance, the belief that he could appeal, that he could find a way out. But deep down, he knew the truth. This was his reality now. And no one was coming to save him. Naomi stood in the mirror that night, looking at the faint scar the coffee burn had left on her cheek. A reminder. Not of the pain, but of the moment a man who had spent his life above consequences finally faced them. She traced her fingers over it for a moment before turning away, flipping off the light as she walked out of the room. The city outside continued on, unchanged, unbothered. But she knew, in some small way, things had shifted. Power had been challenged. Justice had spoken. And no matter how many fought against it, no matter how many tried to resist it, the truth would always come out in the end. And that is the lesson, isn't it? The truth always finds a way. Power may shield the guilty for a time, but no man is untouchable forever. Brian Calloway believed himself invincible, believed that his authority could keep him safe from accountability. But in the end, justice caught up to him, as it always does. What does this story make you feel? Does it make you angry? Satisfied? Uncertain about the way the world works? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like these, stories that challenge, that twist, that make you think, then make sure you subscribe to Tales of Twist. There are more stories to come, and you won't want to miss them.